Tazria Metzora. It's the great one of the portions for B'nai Mitzvah that they look at us with those big eyes and they say, "Really? You want me to read this?" It's about, in particular, what Ken or Kathy will be sharing this evening, which is marked very clearly with a big blinking sign in the Torah, is the passage about the leper, or the person who was seen by the community to have this affliction. And it's these extensive laws in this section of Leviticus about what that person was to go through in order to be welcomed back into the community. But interestingly enough, the Torah understands that the community sees them and that the community has mixed feelings. On the one hand, the community is afraid because if they get too close to the person with this disease, they believed it was a spiritual disease, something that came from within someone but was shown on the outside. They believed if they got too close that they too would suffer from the same ailment. But the Torah also understands that there's a responsibility that we have to that person. And so there was this extensive series of rituals that this person had to go through in order to be welcomed back into the community. One of those is that when the person sees that they have this leprosy, that they shall act almost as if they are a mourner. They should tear their clothes. They shall not take care of their body physically, and that they shall scream out to the community that they are unclean. We don't love this as an idea, but it's also been turned around for us. So bear with me as we do a deep rabbinic dive. So there are 4 roles in this story. We see it sort of as a Broadway play, if you will. First, there's the role of the person with leprosy, the one who the Torah would call the one who's afflicted. That person is supposed to express themselves, tearing their garments, publicly announce that they're suffering from this ailment. Aviva Zornberg explains it. She's a great Torah commentator. She says the following: "The cry of the leper communicates not the public health hazard, but the sheer pain of the individual. It is a religious requirement to affect others so that they will pray for him in his suffering and in his desolation create a connection with the other people around him, even though he has to be separated. The cry of this person interrupts us, it appeals to us, it demands of us that we have to offer compassion. The public sphere is strangely recreated. The leper does not ask for compassion, but knows there is a world of others who will respond if they simply speak up and say, 'I'm suffering.'" The first role, it's the one of the leper who has to cry out with the belief that the world will respond. The second role is the priest. The priest can do many things, we're told. The priest can examine to see how infected the person is. The priest can judge whether the leprosy has run its course or whether the person will be sick for a much longer time. The priest can tell the person, "You have to be outside the camp for this many days," or can welcome them back into the community and tell them that their quarantine is over. But there is one thing that we would love for the priest to be able to do that the priest cannot do, and that is heal the person. The priest has no act of actually changing the situation for the person who's there. The priest acts simply as observer, as judge, as speaker for where this process is. The third person, the person who hears all of this happening, the community member. Zornberg says this is the one who hears the person with leprosy and has to react with compassion. It's the person who has to find this as an ethical moment, because the moment assumes the reality of compassion and suffering with the other who is apart from him or her. And the fourth role is that of the place. In the Midrash, we're told that if the leprous person cannot be rid of their illness, that they turn to the house in which they live in, and they call it a leprous house. In other words, they believe that it must be coming from the place in which they're living, and that God says we must then dig up the foundation of the house because there must be something underneath this foundation that is worth finding. Some say that we read this to tell us that when Tzara'at, leprosy, inflicts our house, that we have the opportunity to find buried treasures underneath it if we start to pull up the foundation. And that those buried treasures could very much be love that we didn't realize was there. So, now that we know the four characters in this play that takes place in Leviticus, I want to try to apply it to what I experienced this week, mostly as an observer of what's going on in our city as we heard the grand jury's response to the Jalen Walker case. And it very much was similar to this concept of being a person watching someone who's afflicted and not knowing that you can do anything about it. But one of the points that struck me as I was talking with our teens about it this week earlier, I think we often fall into the wanting to be the role of the priest. In other words, when most of us talk about the Jalen Walker case or any other case like it that's happening in our country, we play the role of judge. Let me assess what should have happened, or let me assess what I would have said if I were on the jury. But I'd like to believe that that's not our role. I'm sure we all have opinions, and perhaps sometimes it's interesting or even fun to share those opinions with other people. But in the case of the leper, the Torah says our role is to be the one who hears. And much of what I did on Tuesday was listen. Listen to a lot of people who were angry and who had been deeply impacted, who would say perhaps that they've been afflicted with this pain and suffering and constant reminders that their lives are afflicted by society. Particularly, of course, it's this great concern for black men, which was mentioned many times, of what it must feel like to be a black man in our society. But what I heard, perhaps because of where I am in life, is more of a voice of the parents of future black men. How many, they said, life and death conversations do I have to have with my child? So we often talk about this as the conversation that the parent of a black child would have to have about getting pulled over. That you have to put your hands in the right place, that you have to act in a certain way, that you have to speak with a certain tone. Perhaps you have to call me so that I can be on the phone and know where you are, because when you get pulled over, I'm worried it's a life and death situation. But what about the life and death conversation about how you picked your sister up from a friend's house? Do you know the address that you're going to? That could be a life or death situation. Or where you choose to pull over, what neighborhood are you in when you pull over to look at your phone to see if you're going the right direction? That's just two from this week. Or what clothes you're wearing, because if you're wearing your hood up and you walk through a gated neighborhood, that could be a life or death situation. And be sure not to play with toy guns when you're a kid on the playground. Don't run a stop sign. Don't let the light go out on your license plate. Don't go for a jog in a white suburban neighborhood in southern Georgia. Don't dress up for a costume party that has a rubber gun on it, as Roger Owensby did in 2000 in Los Angeles and lost his life. Don't move into an apartment that looks just like the apartment above you, because when the police officer goes into the wrong apartment thinking it's her own, she may shoot you as happened a few years ago, thinking that you were an intruder. And don't drive recklessly like Tyree Nichols did this past January. How many conversations do the parents have to have? That's what I heard as people spoke out of their anger. There's an added piece, because we might say, well, there are people who do things that are bad all over the place. There are people who shouldn't speed or drive recklessly or shouldn't pretend they have a gun when they don't have a gun. So sometimes these are mistakes that lead to other mistakes, or sometimes it's justified, to which some of the speakers shared. The problem is, when Kyle Rittenhouse shot 2 people in the middle of the street in Wisconsin, carrying an AR-15 rifle, he walked down the middle of the road. The police gave him a bottle of water, and he had to turn himself in. The problem is, they said, when Dylan Roof killed 9 people walking into a church in Charleston, when he was taken into custody, they stopped to get him Burger King. So the challenge is that it seems like certain people are suffering differently than other people suffer, and that when some people break the law, they're treated with compassion, and when other people go for a jog, they're not. That's the argument. So I share it not to make the case one way or the other, because I don't think that our role, whatever our opinion might be, is to be the priest. Our role is to be the listener, to say that there's a people who are suffering, and we see them in society. We can see that the suffering is happening. The government's job is to investigate, to decide how deep their suffering is, and to respond. Our job is to listen and figure out where compassion is required. And if we feel that the suffering still exists, then our task is to take the house apart until we get to the foundation so that we can see what's lying underneath all of it, so that we can say, here's where the love is. It's underneath all this mess, but we have to take it apart first. And so in some ways, I think the debates that we have about Jayland Walker, what we think should have happened or shouldn't have happened, or where things could have gone differently, whether you feel that he brought this on himself by breaking traffic laws and shooting a gun out of the window, or whether you feel that it was a gross overuse of force. Those are in some ways opinions that we're not going to be asked to share. But what does matter is, can we hear what all of these parents and kids and officers are afraid of? What is it that is calling upon us to have compassion? That's our job. Are we hearing what they're worried about? Can we get to the bottom of this? One of the constant messages at the rally that I was at was the chant of no justice, no peace. But that presumes that you understand where the justice is missing. I think for many of us, compassion comes before justice. Can we find how to have compassion for people who feel deeply ailed by a disease that's in our country that is seemingly obvious to some and oblivious to many of the rest of us? Can we find a way to see their suffering, a way to take apart the foundation of what creates that environment for them so that we can welcome them back into our community and our society in a way in which they know that they're loved, and they don't have to have constant life and death conversations on a day-to-day basis. In the Torah, the person with leprosy is an Israelite. And later on, the Midrash says that, in fact, leprosy, the house that becomes leprous is, in fact, our entire house, the house of Israel, the people of Israel, that our entire people at times have been so corrupt and misled, they say cursed and abandoned, that we didn't know what to do, but that's what the leprous person feels. They feel alone, they feel separated, but they aren't, because they have the ability to say, I'm suffering, and we have the ability to say, we will help figure out how to put this back together and how to heal you. I hope that we can be a part of that solution. I hope that we, especially as a people who've seen that pain upon our own house, who know what it feels like to be alone and unheard and unnoticed, and who knows that sometimes even the vast majority of people can be wrong about how they understand your situation, can find a way to bring love back to the forefront of this story and compassion back into the lives of those who are missing it. Shabbat Shalom. We'll turn now to that very story in the book of Leviticus as we'll turn to our Torah. We turn to page 246 in our service.